I think this is it for Max Verstappen. This is the time when he cements his place in Formula One history forever. Not because of his domination or his titles or his wins or anything like that, but how he conducts himself going forward from what happened in Singapore. And how all of this is starting to look eerily familiar to what happened with the governing body of Formula One and Ayrton Senna back in the late 80s. I presume you're aware of what's going on presently with Max Verstappen and his beef with the FIA president. Ben Sulayem is right in the middle of a controversy regarding the way that drivers conduct themselves toward the media and the F1 world and fandom. And again, much like the last time this happened in a big way, it's backfired in terms of public relations. Do you recall what happened between Lewis Hamilton and the FIA regarding jewellery and piercings and what have you? Yes, the FIA overall has a rule about jewellery being worn whilst racing, and even though there haven't been any instances of jewellery actually hindering a driver getting in or racing or anything like that, it really came down hard to the point where it's now become a non-issue because Hamilton continues to do what he wants to do and nothing's happened since, so that sort of just went away. Lewis was able to push back successfully, saying that not all of these articles of jewellery were easy to remove and would require a professional to remove safely. You can't just yank the thing out. Now, even though this did get people talking and it was a real hot button topic at the time, it couldn't really relate to that many people who didn't have a piercing or wore jewellery. However, this time around with Verstappen, this is something that pretty much I think everyone has done at least one time in their lives, so people can relate in a bigger way. And that is to do with colourful language. It's kind of like going back to what Sebastian Vettel said about Ferrari, how everyone's a Ferrari fan. It's like how everyone has at least uttered one naughty word in their lifetime, even if it's like poo or bum. Well, they're worse. And now the president of the FIA is clamping down on that harder than ever, and it did not go down well, to the point where the FIA Twitter account went on a blocking spree. And usually when that happens, when a big company or entity does this, they know they done goofed. And what really didn't help was the immediacy of this punishment that Verstappen got just days after Sulayem talked about how he would like to curb swearing in Formula One and motorsport. Then Max gets this community service thing, and incidentally, I talked about Sebastian Vettel. Yeah, he had his fair share of instances where he used colourful language on the podium in 2012 at Abu Dhabi, and basically throughout the entire season of 2016. He was known for many interesting and flavourful comments over the radio. And in those instances, the FIA were just like, naughty, naughty, you're not supposed to be swearing. Ideally, this is a sport that young children watch, so try and curb it, okay? And that was it. So for the stewards to actually serve Verstappen with a community service penalty for saying one expletive, that is really, really heavy-handed. Now, had this been a tirade of epic proportions that was defamatory, then maybe I would understand the penalty. Maybe. Where was this community service punishment when Verstappen went on a tirade over the radio in Hungary? Yes, Verstappen did curb that language in Spa the following race weekend, but we heard nothing when it came to punishments back then. Why now for just one word? In my honest opinion, I think that this could be the moment that truly defines Max Verstappen's legacy within Formula One. And it was probably emboldened by a recent chat that the boss of F1's commercial arm, Stefano Domenicali, had with team principals in July after Verstappen's tirade in Hungary to remind their drivers and everyone else about how they conduct themselves. And let's not forget the rant that Fred Vasseur of Ferrari and Toto Wolff of Mercedes themselves had in Vegas in relation to the manhole cover incident. Remember, they got smacked down with a warning from the FIA regarding their language and the way they conducted themselves, which was not typical of how a team principal should act. But the big difference here between a slap on the wrist and being told that you were a naughty boy and getting a community service punishment like this for just one word, it's a bit night and day in a way. And you might be thinking, well, what's wrong with a community service punishment? Yeah, I get that. It might mean that Max Verstappen has to go to an FIA conference or some kind of event and just go, hey mate, by the way, don't speed. But after what happened this past race weekend, I feel like this could go two ways for Max Verstappen. Two ways where he could cement his place in history, because we will be talking about this for a very long time in the way he conducted himself and the fact that it even happened, as well as pretty much every single driver supporting him, unified in their beliefs that this is utterly ridiculous. It's also misdirected. The drivers aren't the problem, the TV directors are. And I think also this could start a spat again between the FIA and Formula One itself. And even though Stefano Domenicali, the boss of Formula One management, has actually mended ties with Sulayem after the wake of the controversy of Andretti's entry into Formula One, how they had a spat there This could be the issue, Verstappen's cursing, that undoes all of that diplomacy and efforts to rebuild ties. Now, let's get back to Max. I think regardless of what happens going forward, this is one of the few instances where both the haters and the fans of Max Verstappen have actually come together in unity to say, yeah, this is utterly stupid. This was not the way to go about things, and instead, the way that Verstappen carried himself after he got that penalty from the FIA stewards was simply just to comply, going, okay, alright, and that's it, just complying. Work to rule. He turns up at events he's obliged to, but he doesn't say much. But he will have all the time in the world for a journalist who just happens to turn up whilst he's walking around the paddock or near the Red Bull garage. And I think during the grid walk at Singapore, he even had a lot more time for Martin Brundle. He doesn't actually often talk to Max Martin, so this was a bit of a coup, and Max actually seemed in good spirits and willing to talk to Martin Brundle. Only for Brundle to then go on record later on saying that the whole situation regarding Max was churlish all round. Okay, you were joking with Max back then on the grid, so which take is it, Martin? Based on my interpretation of events, I think this was an unnecessary situation. What's wrong with just reminding people that language is a little bit of a hot-button topic? It's a sensitive situation, as is, by the way, the freedom of expression. And I would like to pitch to you, if you think that drivers can curb their language whilst they're driving a 200-mile-an-hour machine, yeah, I would like to try and see you do that. See how you can cope when you're in the middle of a motorway at 70 miles an hour and something really stressful happens. Are you cool as a cucumber most of the time? Probably not. As a result, those who would usually disparage the Dutchman and think he's the greatest villain in F1 history are supporting him, and technically, he wasn't protesting. He was just answering questions and being careful, doing what he was told. Almost as if he were giving a glimpse as to how stilted and unnatural drivers would sound if they were told to behave at all times, and the FIA's way was had. Now, okay, I know what you're about to say. Oh, we're one to talk, especially you, Law. Where were you when Max Verstappen was completely going off the handle on the radio in Hungary? Yes, I will admit, that was kind of a little bit of a grey situation there. The way that Max did carry himself was over the top there. It did become clear that Max did curb his situation because at Spa, he was a lot more serene, a little bit more relaxed. I reckon that Red Bull did have a word about that. But the difference here is, though, is that this was all about one casual word in one random interview when asked about how the car felt. And Max was just being honest to people. But again, where was the community service situation regarding the issue in Hungary? That would have been a bit more appropriate. Still a little bit heavy-handed, but more appropriate than one word in a throwaway interview on Thursday in Singapore. But my biggest issue with the whole affair is that it's got nothing to do with the drivers. They can't really control themselves when they're in the middle of driving a car which can pull 5G in a corner. It's to do with the way the team radio is handled by the people who are in charge of the broadcast. Speaking as somebody who is a third-generation audio-visual content creator, my grandfather did work in London in the 1940s as a filmmaker, and then of course my time as a content creator here has given me some insight as to how things work. The people who are in charge of TV directing really need to actually take a look at themselves and see what they really need to do regarding the situation. Do they actually curb how many times they broadcast bleeped out radio comments, or do they just stop it entirely? They're the ones in charge of picking out the radio bits that we get in the world feed, as well as those who work for the FIA's press department issuing official statements from drivers with language included in quotes. They didn't necessarily have to include that sentence, they could have just used ellipses to move on to the next bit. And the easiest way, as Max Verstappen has said, is just to not include the team radio at all, or don't include bits that include Max Verstappen, or people who are known to actually spout off on the radio. Or, at the very least, just limit the actual scope of what is said. Keep it simple, keep it insightful, but not with colourful language in it. Yes, granted, it will lose some of the authenticity of Formula 1, the raw emotions of an F1 driver in the middle of a really tightly packed battle, but you gotta admit, it would solve the immediate problem. So Mr. Suliam, if you want to tackle this issue effectively and instantly, just talk to the director over in Biggin Hill, F1's Media HQ, and then sort that out there. But then again, they won't, because the allure to include curse words is just simply too strong. You got to admit, whenever Max Verstappen flies off the handle, people will click the article about all of it. It gets revenue, it gets attention, so Formula 1 isn't going to get rid of that. No. In fact, this whole situation, the controversy from the FIA, has caused people to talk about Formula 1 anyway, so All publicity is good publicity. Yeah, I know I sound cynical, but you gotta admit, it's the truth. Outrage spreads itself over the internet more than good news. Oh, and by the way, the chairman of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, Alex Wurz, makes a really good point. If you really want to tackle the situation regarding Formula One and curse words, tell Netflix to stop including them in Drive to Survive! Seriously, it's double standards there. In Drive to Survive, the language we get there is uncensored and everywhere. In fact, probably a lot of people who do watch Drive to Survive watch it to hear the unbleeped radio messages, or the driver's raw opinion and conversations with all of the naughty language there. And Dominicali, well, he seemingly isn't bothered about this and the impact it might have with the younger F1 audience. He adores Drive to Survive's impact on the... So, okay, why does he and Suliam have an issue about it in the here and now? Is it for the fact that he has, and Suliam has, a lack of editorial control? That the drivers are just going off on their own free will? Maybe. If this is a really big issue and you want to tackle bad language in Formula One, tell Netflix to stop including it. You know they won't. And also, let's make one thing clear. Max isn't the only guy who swears. All the drivers at some point in their careers have let out a bleeped word at least once. However, Max has taken it upon himself to be the spokesperson for all of this, and at least the rest of the drivers are seemingly in agreement, because we've now heard that the Grand Prix Drivers Association, them being led, by the way, by George Russell, so he's their representative in terms of driver negotiations, they're going to be actually sitting down together and having a meeting to discuss where they go from here. And in fact, Max Verstappen did allow us a little bit of insight to their WhatsApp group, telling them about his punishment, and everyone going, what the heck, that's absolutely ridiculous. So they were all unified, and as we've seen throughout the entire weekend, all of the drivers are making fun of it. And also, Lando Norris did slip up when he was actually talking about his moment when he did it in the barrier, and then Oscar Piastri was like, without using swear words, what did you think about that? So this has just become a joke to them. They're undermining it in their own way, so who's to say, if a nerve is touched by the higher-ups, that they're not punished as well? Is Norris going to be punished given community service? Is Oscar Piastri going to be given community service for bringing F1 into disrepute? Oh, the disrepute card, I'll be talking about that later. Now, where Max goes from here remains to be seen. Could he leave the sport entirely because he's just fed up with the way he can't be himself and go to World Endurance instead, where there is less attention? Well, maybe, but we gotta remember, the FIA governs that sport as well, meaning he wouldn't escape the eye and the ire of its president. That is a really big point and a very valid one, and this might mean that Max Verstappen might find a completely different sport that is away from the governing body that is the FIA. Perhaps he might quit motorsport altogether and plunge into his sim racing endeavours full time. And he's already displayed how far he will go when it comes to helping out his team. That's why he might have been on a short fuse in Hungary, because he was up late helping them out because they were down a team member. They went on to win that race, by the way. And put simply, Max didn't care about the media backlash he got and the way that David Croft was disparaging him in video games, even though just a few years ago, virtual racing was all that we and the media had to chew on. So, it's funny how memories fade, isn't it? I do think Max could leave F1 off the back of this. He's already made it clear he's achieved his base goal of winning the F1 title, and everything after this is a bonus, but I doubt it when I've been thinking about this for the video. What I do think could happen, though, is that Verstappen might start to wield his influence in a big way, and this might start to transform this entire situation into something that F1 saw the last time one of its figureheads had a war of words with its president. I wish for you to cast your mind back to the late 80s and early 90s, and the situation regarding Ayrton Senna and the president of FISA, Jean-Marie Balestre. Now this makes this situation between Suliam and Verstappen look like child's play. Now, wait a minute, I hear you say, FISA, why isn't that not the FIA? Well, for the short version, it kind of is the FIA, but Balestre sort of spun it off into a little subcommittee, so that means the FIA could focus on karting at the time in the late 70s, so this was sort of its own thing, and he could control it in his own whim. He was also the president of the FIA at the time, so it was really confusing, but either way, this was his little playground. He could execute maximum control, and he did. Michael Massey, he can't hold a candle to Jean-Marie. Between 1988 and 1991, Senna and Balestre clashed multiple times. In this situation, it was mostly down to accusations of bias in relation to Senna's arch-rival Alain Prost, to which conspiracies ran rife all the way back to Monaco 1984, when that race was stopped in monsoon-like conditions because Prost told them to. And they actually complied. just before Senna could overtake the Frenchman and pull off a David versus Goliath victory at the track which he would ultimately go on to win and dominate. Then there were instances in Suzuka, 1989 and 1990. 89, when Prost and Senna collided, which Prost thought would guarantee him the championship. Senna rejoined the track, supposedly in an unsafe manner, which was enough to disqualify him. And then in 1990, the situation regarding the Turn 1 incident between Prost and Senna, which gave Senna the title. And then after years, Senna admitted that he did it deliberately after Balestreand was gone, but Balestreand threatened to suspend his license, and he only got it back, Senna, after he had to apologize because Senna absolutely loved Formula One that much that he couldn't be without it. It got really bad. Senna was outspoken in his rage and feelings of injustice toward the FISA president, and he would lash back at him hard and just come up with any sort of excuse to get rid of Senna's super license, and he would do so on 2 occasions. However, people did take notice, and this was in a time before social media, even before the internet as we know it. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, the internet didn't really exist as we know it. It was mainly just used for networking or maybe for professional reasons and purposes. But ultimately, Senna did win out, and by 1991, Jean-Marie Balestre was then replaced with Max Mosley. He then stepped down in 1993 from the FIA presidentship, and ultimately Senna fell in love back with Formula One, and he actually showed himself in no uncertain terms how annoyed he was with the resistance from Balestre. And his statement right here, it's filled with expletives, and he was absolutely frank with us, and this would just make Max Verstappen's comments look like absolute diddly squat. Now, of course, I am really oversimplifying things here, and I strongly urge you to take a look at this in your own time, because this situation regarding Senna and Balestre, it's absolutely historic, and Senna was not afraid to pull any of his punches about his sentiments regarding Balestre. Now, of course, the situation with Sulliam and Verstappen, it's only just beginning, but we are starting to see more and more situations where the words of the FIA president are starting to cause a lot of negative news and coverage regarding the sport right when it's at a peak, and when it could even get more popular when Lewis Hamilton goes to Ferrari. Next year is looking so intense in terms of a championship battle. This could all be muddied with the controversy surrounding one of its biggest drivers and the FIA president who governs the sport. And Dominicali, right now, have you noticed he's actually been a bit quiet? He's not been saying anything regarding this particular situation. At least I've not heard anything about it. Now, could this repeat itself in a similar but different way? May I remind you, all this played out at a time where there was no social media, so right now, it's a completely different kettle of fish in that regard, as people can now talk about it at free will with everybody, because all F1 fans had at the time were TV broadcasts and magazines. And I don't think you need me to tell you that the FIA president has been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons since he took up office at the beginning of 2022. He's actually promised to step back from Formula One and focus on the rest of the governing body's duties with all of the other motorsports that it governs, including Formula E, which really does need some attention, especially since it went behind a paywall 10 or 15 years too early. So there are plenty of other motorsports, including the future and karting, to really pay attention to. But Ben Sulayem cannot help himself and just make his opinions clear, which are completely generalized, and they just court controversy. They are just inappropriate. And it's just the situation now where it's actually affecting the way that drivers can behave. And it's just so draconian, it's unnecessary. And all it will do is just make F1 look like a joke. All of this has resulted in Max Verstappen, the star driver of Formula One right now, like Senna was the star driver of Formula One at the time, making his opinions loud and clear. But this time, Max is technically not breaking any rules. He's just doing what the FIA has told him to do, literally. Not swearing, can't get mad. Not swearing, can't get mad. Now, out of all of this, could the FIA pull out that infamous disrepute card? We've heard about that all of the time in recent years, and going back decades, about the FIA talking about a driver or a team or an incident bringing the sport into disrepute and making the entire sport look bad. And those punishments, they can be really, really big, including going up to and including disqualification from the championship. Supposedly with Michael Schumacher in 1997 when he clashed with Villeneuve, that incident technically brought F1 into disrepute, which is why partially he was disqualified. At least I recall. I don't think it will go that far, but the fact is though, is that we've now seen one of Sulayem's takes regarding swearing being enacted by the stewards in such a short space of time between the words being said from the FIA president to then actually being put into effect. And the drivers, they are against it. The fans, They are against it. The governing body has recognized this, and it's on the defensive. Where does it go from here? How does Max Verstappen handle this? How does he go? What does he do? And what might be the outcome? Might it repeat itself from what we saw back in the early 90s? Remains to be seen. How will the FIA brace for impact regarding this one? And how does Valtteri Bottas brace for impact regarding the joint pressure from two of South America's most talented rookies in recent memory? Can he survive their appeal and not hit a bum note on the way? Well, you can find out all about why I think that this might be the end for Bottas in this video here that you can go and watch right now.